Ready to go, yes.
Okay, well, so maybe for starters, if you can just tell us a little bit about your, as far back as you can remember, really, your early childhood.
Yeah, well, I'm Wallace Campbell, and if I'm in the Air Force, I'd have to say 410036. And in early childhood, when I was about 4.5, I was the man of the family because of things that happened. To get into what happened there, I've got to go back a bit further. My father, when he was 13, he left school and his mother died, and he went wheeling sawdust at a sawmill. It's strange to think today that a fairly big sawmill would have kids on wheeling wheelbarrows to take the sawdust out from under the saws. But that's what he did for a start when he was 13. When he was 23, he was serving in a shop in Warrnambool, and his mother was dead, his father was batching, and he was living mainly with his cousins in Grasmere. But he'd saved up enough money and he reckoned he was going to go to Scotch College, and he went to Scotch College with what he'd saved and to study the subjects that would qualify him to be a Presbyterian minister, or to start the 4 years training as a Presbyterian minister. You have to have other qualifications before that. So in 1914 he went to Scotch College as a boarder, and other things happened in 1914, and they wouldn't have him in the army. They reckon his heart wasn't good enough. He had been in the Warrnambool Defence Battery. They've got cannons they set up there, great old rusty things now, but he was in the crew of those, and so he thought, I suppose that'd have influenced him to go to the war and volunteer. So he volunteered and he was rejected, so he kept on at school to earn a bit more money. He used to report on the court cases for the Argus, and he used to sell insurance. I'll put people's name in as having been sold. That's what he told me. It was a big take, that. Go around the cemetery and look at people's names on the tombstones. And then at the end of 1916, his brother got married and came down, and the result of that was that he deferred from his schooling. He'd done very well academically. He deferred from his schooling, and he got married himself, and he went back to work in partnership with his brother, who was share farming a very big dairy farm down in Grasmere. And so that went on through the war. He became a cheese maker. He learned how to make cheese then, and he learned how to kill pigs and send them to the meat market. In those days, a lot of the Melbourne's meat come from the country already dressed. They'd kill a pig or calves and put them in a bag, ashen bag, and they'd put them on the train, and they had specially ventilated trucks. It wasn't refrigerated, it was just the air could get through them. And then overnight they'd go to Melbourne. Then they took them to the dead meat market, and they auctioned them off. And because of the auctioning going on, and Dad found they always got better prices if he was there when they sold them. It's because they sold his stuff as his then. And so he got to know all the Melbourne pork business. And the war finished. And then they had to talk, those two brothers, because the Campbells had taken up an original selection at Framlingham. And my grandfather, this is an interesting thing, that my grandfather, when he was 16 years old, with a couple of 16-year-old mates, they built a house. It was just a four-room, one of those old four-roomed houses with sawn weatherboards and corrugated iron for the roof they got. And they still owned that. But at that time, my grandfather had been living, batching in it, with a few sheep. And it had all run down. It still had log fences all around it. You walk around against the log fences. And the two brothers decided that they'd have to take it over, and it was 120 acres. They'd take it over and they'd do it up for a dairy farm, get going as a dairy farm in partnership. It's funny today for having 20 acres and a dairy farm. Anyway, Dad was decided that Dad would go into the little old house, or still the original house was there, Dad and Mum, and the other brother would carry on with his share farming, and with the money from that he'd pay off the mortgage. It was heavily mortgaged, of course, that's how the grandfather had been living, and he'd pay it off. So that became the situation. And they were there for 4 years. Well, I married for 4 years before I was born. I married in 1916. I was born in 1920. And while we were there at Framlingham. And anyway, shortly after I was there, I suppose, or perhaps when my brother Don was born in 1922, they decided there wasn't enough money there because he was putting all the money they got into fencing and all that sort of stuff. And he wasn't getting much money back out of the place. And he decided he'd go to Melbourne, and with what he'd learned about the pork butchery business, or the pork business in Melbourne, he'd opened a special pork shop. So he went down to Melbourne, he got that going, and he went pretty good. He went around all the biggest hotels in Melbourne, got their pork off him. But the trouble was that his wife got the Spanish flu, and she didn't die though, but she lived through it. That's my mother. And my brother, he was only a little thing about so many months old, and he got interception, they called it. It was a part of the bowel sort of got inside itself. So that was an operation at the Children's Hospital. And then Dad started to get crook. And he had a man working for him, but he reckoned the till was always light when the fellow was working there. But he couldn't, and finally he got too crook to work himself and decided he'd have to give it away. And he'd go back to Warrnambool, because that's only if there was no pensions or anything in those days, if you were crook. He'd go back there where all his cousins and uncles and that were, family support. So he went back to the Warrnambool Hospital, and my mother and the two little fellas, we went back to the old house. And where someone gave her one of the uncles gave her a house cow. And that's when I became the man of the house. And I sort of ever since, and I think that must influence me because I've always been looking after people ever since. And anyway, that was that. And anyway, I found that the trouble with Dad was that he had an ingrown wisdom tooth. It had grown too far back in the angle of his jaw. So it grew, instead of coming out into his mouth, it went up in the bone. And that was what was causing him all the trouble. So they took that out, and after a bit of recuperation, he came home there, and sort of his uncles and that around, they sort of, it was all a family helping situation, and they fed him up with a herd of cows on the basis that he'd have them for the first year, and that'd break him in to get used to being milked in the bales and that was all the hard work of milking cows, so he'd had them for the first year. But that gave them a bit of income. So that went on, and it comes a rather long story. And those days, it's the story of those Depression days. The Depression came on then, and they got an immigrant from England to work with them as a man, and anyway, then another 20 acres adjoining our place came on the market. And so Dad said, well, we've got to buy that. If we're going to run this place in partnership, we need more land. We'll have to buy this 20 acres. So they went in to buy it, and when they got in there at the solicitors, then my mother got very upset because she found that though there'd been supposed to be a partnership, that my uncle, because he'd paid the mortgages off, and that the place was all in his name. And Mum said, we're not going to stay here for the rest of our lives, and then our children won't get anything out of it. And she did a lot of talking about that around the house. And we had that English fellow, he used to live in the house with us. He had a room there, and it was only 4 little rooms. And he talked about outside. The next thing that happened was that they discovered, they said, now Mr Campbell, do we discover, is that true that you haven't got any equity in this place? You'll have to pay for your groceries when you order them. And the stock agent said, we can't leave any money swinging on the place because you haven't got any equity in it. You'll have to pay us back. And that sort of changed the whole nature of their operation, because it was all in those days, and you sort of bought things and then you paid for them at the end of the month or something. And so they had to, things would become very difficult. And Dad and Mum, I've heard talk about this a few times, they collected up the money that they owed the English fellow that was working with them. They used to put it all in a book, you see, and he'd get some when he went out. He'd draw some money out, and it was all the book entries. And so they collected up the money that was owed him and said, and had called him in. They said, look, we can't afford you anymore because of this situation. You'll have to go. But of course, very difficult to go in those days. There was no work around. And he pleaded with him, he said, let me stay here. He said, I don't want the money. He said, you use the money to get back on your feet and just keep putting my wages down as a book entry, and I'll never need that money that's owing to me. I don't know, I think it was about $200 or something, putting in today's money. And so Dad, and because the stock agents had taken back some of the cows, some of the stock, you see, and so Dad and he went cutting wood to get money coming in. They went into the Framingham Forest, which is now Aborigines own. It was owned by the community then, and cut wood for firewood for Warrnambool. And they'd cut it all day. They'd bring home what they cut, throw it all out in the yard, and then Don and I, that was 2 little fellas, we'd stack it in rows for dry out for a few weeks. And then they'd cart the 16 miles into Warrnambool behind the horses and sell it, hawk it around the houses. And of course, it might help it when there were so many relatives in there too. But so they had no difficulty in selling it, but there wasn't a great deal of money in it. And so that went on for a while, and I suppose that English fellow found it a bit hard work, cutting out there, cutting wood all day, because next thing he said he wanted to get married. He had a girlfriend, and she was a butcher's daughter, and the butcher would give him work, because they were still killing pigs and sending them away to Melbourne, you see, they'd been done before, and he'd learned how to be a butcher, and the butcher would give him work in his butcher shop, and the butcher told him he should get his money. And he wanted to be paid all this back money. Well, Dad didn't have it by then, because what had happened when he said he didn't want the money, and Dad thought he'd get a bit cunning, and he went and he bought about 30 sow pigs, fairly close to having little ones. And he said, as soon as the rain comes, he said, they'll be worth 3 times as much as they are now for the farmers, for the milk. And he said, for 3 weeks they can live on grass, and they've got a paddock full of grass there, they can live on that for 3 weeks. So they brought them home, spent all the money on them, and then there was a drought turned up, and they all died. I think they all died. And so the money was gone. And so the next thing, the